The Battle of Tumbleton has finally arrived, but the real shock is not who won the battle. It is what this battle has done to the future of Westeros. A once thriving town has been reduced to ruins, loyalties have been shattered, dragons have turned on their own side, and Rhaenyra's grip on the Iron Throne is becoming weaker with every passing moment. But that is only the beginning, because while Rhaenyra believes she is getting closer to victory, another threat is quietly rising from the ashes. Aegon II is still alive. Helena's final fate has changed everything, and the mysterious clues left behind in Helena's tapestry may have already revealed the dark ending waiting for Rhaenyra. So what really happened during the Battle of Tumbleton? Why did Ulf the White betray Rhaenyra? Where has Prince Daeron disappeared to? And most importantly, does Helena's final vision reveal how Rhaenyra's story will end? Today, we are breaking down the ending of House of the Dragon Season 3, Episode 8, explaining the biggest moments, the changes from Fire and Blood, and the shocking clues that could shape the final season. The Battle of Tumbleton was always going to be one of the biggest moments of the season, and when it finally arrived, it became clear just how brutal this war had become. Rhaenyra had already discovered that her brother Aegon II was still alive. After surviving what should have been the end of his story, Aegon had managed to escape with Sunfire and had even defeated the forces at Maidenpool. That changed everything for Rhaenyra. Until this moment, she could believe that removing Aegon from the picture would eventually end the struggle for the Iron Throne. But now her greatest enemy was alive again. And worse, his return was being seen by many people as a sign from the gods. This is why Rhaenyra wanted Daemon to move against Tumbleton immediately. She understood that waiting could give Aegon more time to rebuild his strength. The war had already become a dangerous game of military chess, with both sides waiting for the other to make the first move. But Rhaenyra could no longer afford to wait. She needed a victory, and Tumbleton appeared to be the place where she could finally deliver one. The problem was that the Green forces were not exactly led by the strongest military commander. Aemond Hightower appeared completely out of his depth. Instead of facing Daemon's army with confidence, he relied on desperate measures to slow them down. Children were sent toward the front lines in the hope that Daemon and the Northmen would hesitate before attacking. It was a disturbing decision, and it showed just how desperate the Green Army had become. Gwaine and Daeron understood that Tumbleton could be destroyed if the fighting continued, so they attempted to offer Daemon a peaceful solution. They even proposed a political arrangement based on the old days before Aegon the Conqueror united Westeros. The idea was that the realm could once again be divided, with different rulers controlling different parts of the kingdom. Daeron could have Old Town and become a powerful figure in the south, but Daemon was not interested. For him, this was no longer simply about dividing territory. The war had become personal, and Rhaenyra needed the enemy destroyed. There was also another problem hiding inside the Green Army. Ulf the White had disappeared, and neither Daemon nor the Green commanders fully understood where his loyalty truly stood. That question was answered in the most brutal way possible. When Ulf finally appeared with his dragon, Daemon's forces initially believed their situation had completely changed. They thought Ulf had returned to strengthen their side, and that his dragon would give them the advantage they needed. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to turn in their favor. Then Ulf betrayed them. Instead of attacking the enemy, he unleashed his dragon's fire on the very soldiers he was supposed to support. The cheering immediately turned into panic. Men who believed they were about to win suddenly found themselves running for their lives as their supposed ally attacked them from above. And Ulf did not stop there. He also turned against Aemond Hightower. Then the fire spread through Tumbleton itself. The town that had once been a thriving market center was transformed into a burning nightmare. Buildings were destroyed, people were killed, and the streets became filled with smoke, bodies, and screams. There was no true winner anymore. Both armies had suffered, and Tumbleton itself had paid the greatest price. Aemond Hightower eventually met his end at the hands of Roderick the Ruin. His death was brutal and fitting for a commander who had spent much of the battle hiding behind desperate tactics. Roderick had already made it clear that he was prepared to die. He had traveled south knowing that returning home was unlikely, and his actions during the battle showed exactly what kind of warrior he was. But even after Aemond fell, the battle did not suddenly become a victory for Rhaenyra. The streets of Tumbleton told a different story. Parents were left searching for children who had been sent into danger. Bodies filled the town, and survivors were forced to walk through the destruction left behind by the dragons. The devastation was so complete that Tumbleton could never simply return to the thriving market town it had once been. And this is where the victory becomes a problem for Rhaenyra. The people of King's Landing will not know that Ulf betrayed his own side. They will simply hear that another town has been destroyed during Rhaenyra's war. To ordinary people, it does not matter who ordered the attack or which dragon changed sides. They only see the destruction. That means Rhaenyra's rule is about to become even more unstable. Earlier, she had warned Daemon that the realm was watching and begged him not to turn her into a monster. But the tragedy of Tumbleton is that Daemon was not the one who created the image she feared. Ulf did. And now Rhaenyra must face the consequences of a battle she desperately needed to win. But while Tumbleton burns, another tragedy is unfolding elsewhere. Helaena has reached the end of her story, and her death may be far more important than it first appears, because before she disappeared, she left behind a final clue that could reveal exactly what awaits Rhaenyra when the Dance of the Dragons finally reaches its bloody conclusion. Helena's death was not just another tragedy in the Dance of the Dragons. It may have been the moment that finally broke the last fragile connection between Rhaenyra and the people of King's Landing. For most of the season, Helena's story had been moving toward this moment, and the clues were there long before the finale. She had already been traumatized by the death of her son, and now she had learned something that made her situation even more hopeless. Aegon was still alive. The revelation came through Mysaria, who told Helaena that her brother had survived. But instead of giving her hope, the news only made her understand how trapped she really was. She knew that she could not simply walk away from King's Landing. She was still a prisoner, and with her unborn child, there was almost no chance that she could escape the terrible cycle surrounding her family. And this is what makes her final decision so heartbreaking. Helaena had spent much of her life seeing things that other people could not understand. Her strange words and visions often sounded meaningless at first, but later events gave them a completely different meaning. She was not simply predicting random events. She appeared to understand that the Dance of the Dragons was leading everyone toward a terrible ending. Her tapestry becomes especially important here. Throughout the season, Helaena had been connected to images and symbols that seemed to reveal pieces of the future. One of the most disturbing images showed Rhaenyra sitting upon the Iron Throne while flames surrounded her. At first, it might look like a simple symbol of war, but after everything that happens in the finale, that image becomes much darker. Because Rhaenyra may eventually get exactly what she wants. She may sit on the Iron Throne, but she may also lose everything because of it. The show strongly suggests that Helaena knew her own death was coming, and when she finally walked toward the window, the moment felt less like an impulsive decision and more like someone who had accepted that there was no escape left for her. What makes the scene even more disturbing is the way her family had treated her before this point. Her mother was not there to protect her. Her sister had been cruel toward her. Rhaenyra's actions had also made her life even more unbearable. Helaena had already lost her son because of the war between the Greens and Blacks. Now she understood that her family was continuing to destroy itself around her. And then she was gone. But there is an important difference between the show and the book. In Fire and Blood, Helena's death carries more mystery. The people of King's Landing loved her, and because of that, her death becomes another reason for them to turn against Rhaenyra. Rumors spread that Rhaenyra may have been responsible for what happened. The show appears to make the event much more direct. Helaena seems to make the decision herself, and the image of her body on the spikes makes the tragedy even darker. But there is another detail that could become extremely important later. Helaena had already been suffering because of blood and cheese. She never truly recovered from losing her son. Her grief stayed with her, and it changed the way she looked at the world. That means her final vision may not simply be about her own death. It may also be about Rhaenyra. The tapestry shows Rhaenyra surrounded by flames while sitting on the Iron Throne. And if you know what happens in Fire and Blood, that image becomes almost impossible to ignore. Rhaenyra does eventually lose the throne, and her ending is far more brutal than she could ever imagine. In the book, Rhaenyra is eventually killed by her own brother, Aegon II, with sunfire. She is burned and then consumed by the dragon. That is why the flames surrounding her on the tapestry feel so important. Helaena may have been showing Rhaenyra exactly what her future looked like. And there is something even more interesting about Rhaenyra's reaction. When she sees the image of herself surrounded by flames, she seems to understand that it is not a good sign, but instead of confronting what it means, she simply covers the window and continues moving forward, almost as if she has decided that she cannot afford to think about the future anymore. That is one of the biggest tragedies of Rhaenyra's character. She has spent so much of her life fighting to become queen that she is now becoming trapped by the very power she wanted. Every victory costs her something. Every step toward the Iron Throne creates another enemy. And every decision she makes pushes the realm closer to complete destruction. But Helena's death also creates another huge question. What happens to the people of King's Landing now? Helaena was one of the few members of the royal family who still had genuine sympathy from ordinary people. Her death can turn grief into anger. And when people are already hungry, frightened, and exhausted by war, they do not need much of a reason to turn against their ruler. Rhaenyra may believe that taking the Iron Throne gives her control, but Helena's death could prove that the throne is actually beginning to control her. And while Rhaenyra is struggling to hold on to power, another Targaryen has already started making plans. Aegon II is alive, and unlike the broken man we saw earlier, he now has a new goal. He wants his throne back. The biggest question is whether he will remain hidden or finally make his move toward King's Landing. Because the Aegon we see now is not simply running away anymore. He is preparing for war, and his next target could completely change the balance of the Dance of the Dragons. Aegon's story has taken a very different path from the one told in Fire and Blood, and that difference could completely change how the final chapter of the Dance of the Dragons unfolds. In the book, Aegon's survival is kept hidden for much longer, and his sudden appearance becomes one of the biggest surprises of the story. But the show has chosen to reveal his survival earlier, and that means we already know something Rhaenyra still has to discover. Aegon is alive, and now he wants his throne back. When Aegon arrives at Harrenhal, his original intention is clear. He wants revenge against his brother Aemond. After everything that Aemond has done, it would make sense for Aegon to believe that killing him is the first step toward reclaiming his position. But when Aegon finally sees Aemond, something unexpected happens. He cannot do it. Aemond is no longer the same man he once was. He looks exhausted, weakened, and almost broken by everything that has happened. His hunger for power has been damaged by the war, and for the first time, Aegon sees someone who may no longer be the threat he once believed him to be. Instead of killing his brother, Aegon reveals what he really wants. He wants to find Vhagar. He wants to go to Tumbleton. He wants to eliminate the remaining opposition, and then he wants to march toward King's Landing and take the Iron Throne back from Rhaenyra. That is a major change from the book. In Fire and Blood, Aegon does not immediately follow this exact path. After Rhaenyra leaves King's Landing, Aegon eventually seeks safety on Dragonstone. His story develops differently, and the eventual confrontation between him and Rhaenyra happens under completely different circumstances. But the show appears to be creating a much more direct collision. Aegon is moving toward Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra is trying to hold on to King's Landing, and both sides believe the Iron Throne belongs to them. The most interesting part is that Aegon may actually have something Rhaenyra desperately needs: the support of the people. Rhaenyra's relationship with King's Landing has become increasingly unstable. She believes that her bloodline and her father's decision are enough to prove that she is the rightful queen. But ordinary people do not always care about royal bloodlines. They care about food. They care about safety. They care about whether their children will survive. And after the destruction caused by the war, Rhaenyra is beginning to look less like a savior and more like another ruler demanding their loyalty. That becomes even more obvious during her attempt to receive the blessing of the faith. Rhaenyra desperately wants the High Septons to recognize her as the chosen ruler. She needs the people to believe that the gods support her claim. But the High Septon refuses. He does not believe that Rhaenyra has been chosen by the gods. And that refusal puts her in an extremely dangerous position. Because instead of stepping back, Rhaenyra orders his death. That single decision tells us a lot about how much she has changed. Earlier, Rhaenyra wanted to prove that she was the rightful ruler. She wanted the realm to accept her because of her father's wishes and her Targaryen blood. Now she is willing to kill the religious leader who refuses to support her. And then she walks outside and announces herself as queen. But the reaction is not what she expected. There are no great cheers, there is no celebration, there is no overwhelming support from the people. Instead, there is silence, confusion, fear. The people do not know what to make of her. And that is perhaps the biggest problem Rhaenyra faces. She is trying to force people to believe that she is their rightful queen while doing very little to make them actually want her as their queen. She even compares herself to Aegon the Conqueror. But the comparison does not work. Aegon the Conqueror united Westeros through overwhelming military power and fear. Rhaenyra is struggling to control a single city, while a civil war tears the kingdom apart. She wants to be seen as powerful, but the people can see the desperation behind her actions. And that desperation becomes even more dangerous when Aegon begins moving again. Because if Aegon reaches King's Landing, Rhaenyra could suddenly find herself surrounded by people who are already questioning her rule. The throne she fought so hard to claim could become a trap. And then there is Aemond. His future is just as uncertain. Aegon has chosen not to kill him, but that does not mean their conflict is finished. The two brothers have spent too much time fighting for the same crown, and the dance has turned their family relationship into something almost impossible to repair. Aemond still has Vhagar, and Vhagar remains one of the most terrifying weapons in Westeros. But Aemond is also becoming increasingly isolated. His decisions have caused enormous destruction, and his relationship with his own family has collapsed. The question is whether he will remain at Harrenhal or eventually join Aegon in his attempt to reclaim King's Landing. That question becomes especially important because the story is now moving toward one of the most famous confrontations in the entire Dance of the Dragons, the battle above the God's Eye. Daemon and Aemond are on a collision course, and if the show follows the direction of the book, that confrontation could become one of the defining moments of the entire series. But before that happens, there is another mystery that needs to be answered. Where is Prince Daeron? His disappearance from the chaos of Tumbleton could be far more important than it first appears, because Daeron was one of the few members of the Green family who still seemed to have some sense of honor. And after the destruction of Tumbleton, his fate could determine what happens next. Was he killed in the chaos? Did he escape? Is he somewhere nearby with Tessarion? Or is he preparing to return when nobody expects him? The answer could completely change the balance of power. And if Daeron survived Tumbleton, then the Greens may still have another major player waiting to enter the war. The Dance of the Dragons is far from over. In fact, after everything that happened in this finale, it feels like the real ending is only beginning. The Battle of Tumbleton may be over, but one of the biggest questions coming out of the finale is surprisingly simple. Where is Prince Daeron? During the chaos, Daeron was nowhere to be found. The town was burning, people were running through the streets, and Silverwing was unleashing destruction across Tumbleton. Gwaine Hightower somehow survived the disaster, but Daeron disappeared. The last time we really saw him, the situation was already falling apart. He was caught in the middle of a battle that had become almost impossible to control. The Greens were divided, the Blacks were attacking, and Ulf the White had completely changed the situation by turning his dragon against the people he was supposed to fight alongside. So what happened to Daeron? The obvious answer would be that he died during the battle, but there is a major reason to question that. In Fire and Blood, Daeron survives the first Battle of Tumbleton. In fact, his survival becomes extremely important because the Greens are still divided after the battle, and Daeron becomes one of the central figures among those who remain. That means his disappearance from the finale could be hiding something much bigger.